It is often assumed that once a person became a prisoner of war in the Second World War, their treatment followed a single clearly defined script written by international law. That assumption holds only if one looks at captivity in broad strokes. When examined closely, especially through the experience of female prisoners of war, it becomes clear that captivity was less a fixed condition and more a daily process shaped by systems, habits, and administrative choices. Clothing, hygiene, and personal identity were not secondary concerns in this process. They were the mechanisms through which authority was exercised and order was maintained. The legal framework governing prisoners of war appeared, on its surface, comprehensive. The Geneva Convention established obligations regarding adequate clothing, sanitary conditions, medical care, and respect for rank and person. These rules were intended to be universal, and in principle they were. Yet they were written with a particular kind of prisoner in mind, a male combatant in uniform, captured as part of an organized military force. Female prisoners entered this framework not as an exception written into the rules, but as an unspoken assumption that the rules would somehow accommodate them. The resulting gap between policy and reality reveals much about how wartime systems actually functioned. Female prisoners of war came from varied backgrounds. Some were nurses or medical auxiliaries attached to armed forces. Others were members of auxiliary services, communications units, or anti-aircraft crews. In certain theaters, particularly on the Eastern Front, women served as regular soldiers and were captured as such. There were also women who began captivity as civilian detainees or resistance members and were later reclassified as POWs. These distinctions mattered administratively because POW systems relied heavily on classification. Yet the systems themselves were rarely flexible enough to respond to this diversity in any consistent way. Clothing provides an instructive starting point. In theory, prisoners were expected to retain their original uniforms, which served several purposes at once. Uniforms signaled nationality and rank, reinforced discipline, and reduced the administrative burden of issuing new clothing. For male prisoners captured in large numbers, this system functioned tolerably well. For women, it often did not. Female uniforms varied widely between nations and services, and many women were captured without standardized military dress at all. In practice, this meant that clothing allocation depended less on regulation and more on circumstance. In camps operated by Axis powers, particularly Germany, the stated policy emphasized retention and repair rather than replacement. As long as clothing remained technically wearable, it was not replaced. For female prisoners, this often meant prolonged use of garments unsuited to climate or labor. When replacement became unavoidable, improvised solutions were common. Women might receive altered male uniforms, surplus civilian clothing, or items sourced locally. These measures were not designed to erase identity, but they often had that effect, reducing individuality to whatever the supply system could accommodate. Hygiene followed a similar pattern of policy clarity and practical ambiguity. Regulations required washing facilities, regular bathing where possible, and measures to control lice and disease. These requirements were grounded as much in military pragmatism as in humanitarian obligation. Disease outbreaks threatened camp stability and labor output. Yet most camps were designed with male prisoners in mind, and female hygiene needs were not systematically planned for. Separate facilities, when they existed at all, were often created after the fact. In practice, access to hygiene infrastructure varied widely. Some camps established scheduled washing times for women, limiting access to ensure control and order. Others relied on shared facilities under supervision. Menstrual hygiene supplies were rarely standardized within military logistics. Responsibility for addressing the issue often fell to camp medical officers, whose responses depended on available resources and personal priorities. Where materials were available, substitutes were provided. Where they were not, the issue was quietly deferred. The result was not a single experience, but a spectrum shaped by logistics rather than law. Identity, perhaps the most abstract of these concerns, was managed through administrative categorization. Prisoners were recorded by nationality, rank, and service branch. These categories determined rations, labor assignments, and disciplinary procedures. Gender was not always treated as a primary category, and this had consequences. Female prisoners were sometimes excluded from labor programs designed around male physical expectations, which in turn affected access to work-related privileges such as additional rations. Personal appearance was regulated inconsistently, not necessarily as punishment, but as an extension of a system that valued uniformity over differentiation. By contrast, Allied-run POW camps illustrate how different administrative cultures produce different outcomes within the same legal framework. Allied authorities, particularly in Britain and the United States, translated international law into detailed operational guidance. Clothing issuance was standardized, inventories were maintained, and replacement schedules were established. Female prisoners received uniforms, undergarments, and footwear appropriate to climate and assigned duties. Laundry services were institutionalized, reflecting an understanding that cleanliness was integral to camp order. Hygiene policy in these camps similarly reflected a managerial approach. Gender-segregated facilities were created where women were present, and medical oversight included attention to female-specific needs. This was not simply a matter of compassion. Allied administrators viewed hygiene as essential to preventing disease and maintaining discipline. Problems were documented, reported, and when possible, corrected through bureaucratic channels. Shortages still occurred, but they were more likely to be acknowledged as deficiencies rather than absorbed into routine. Identity management followed the same logic. Female prisoners were housed and assigned work with explicit recognition of gender. Labor assignments often reflected contemporary assumptions, favoring clerical, textile, or kitchen tasks, but they were nevertheless integrated into the camp economy. Names, ranks, and personal effects were recorded systematically. Identity was preserved not primarily for the prisoner's benefit, but because it simplified administration and reduced friction. What becomes clear when examined closely is that the differences between these systems were less about stated intent and more about capacity and institutional habit. Both Axis and Allied powers referenced the same conventions. Both articulated similar principles. Yet their ability to implement those principles depended on resources, planning assumptions, and administrative flexibility. Where systems were rigid or overstretched, female prisoners became anomalies managed through improvisation. Where systems were bureaucratically dense and well supplied, adaptation was more systematic. This distinction mattered because daily routines accumulated into long-term effects. Clothing that could not be replaced deteriorated. Hygiene practices that were irregular allowed minor conditions to persist. Identity that was administratively blurred limited access to work, representation, and recognition. These outcomes were not always the result of deliberate neglect. More often, they emerged from systems designed for one population being applied to another without sufficient adjustment. The experience of female POWs, therefore, offers a valuable lens for understanding the Second World War as a whole. It reveals how international law functioned in practice, not as an absolute guarantee, but as a framework filtered through national systems. It shows how gender, though rarely foregrounded in policy, influenced implementation in quiet but consequential ways. And it demonstrates that captivity was shaped not only by ideology or intent, but by supply chains, paperwork, and institutional priorities. In the years after the war, these lessons informed changes in humanitarian law and military planning. Recognition that existing conventions inadequately addressed gender-specific needs contributed to later revisions and expanded protections. More broadly, historians came to understand POW camps not as static spaces of uniform experience, but as dynamic administrative environments where policy met reality on a daily basis. To examine clothing, hygiene, and identity in this context is to look at how large systems express themselves through ordinary routines. These routines reveal priorities more clearly than official declarations. They show how war is administered not only through strategy and combat, but through laundry schedules, medical logs, and classification forms. For those seeking to understand how the Second World War actually functioned beyond the battlefield, this perspective invites further examination, and future explorations can continue to trace how policy, practice, and human presence intersected across the many systems of wartime captivity. In reflecting on these mechanisms, the subject ultimately leads back to a broader understanding of the war itself, not as a single narrative of intention or morality, but as a vast collection of systems under pressure, adapting unevenly to circumstances they had not fully anticipated. Through that lens, the management of female prisoners of war becomes less a side story and more a revealing chapter in how the modern world learned, often imperfectly, to regulate conflict,